Good morning, students. I think for all purposes that I would like to begin another lecture with you and review some of the background still to the Odyssey. And my plan is, after this initial second round of background information, next week I'll begin a textual study of the poem by going through obviously certain chapters. I've already asked you to begin reading and read as much as you possibly can. And you have already, and I guess I should take a moment and explain what I plan to do next week to offer you, again, a kind of assurance. I do have the grades on the Iliad major exam. I've already graded the questions that you had initially submitted on the Odyssey, and probably today I'm going to give you, at the end of my discussion, another round of questions. And after you submit these, by the end of next week, through email, I'm going to give you a statement in email indicating your 4 grades since we had left Sam Houston. That is before the break, before all of this horrific events occurred. So probably the order will be something like this. I'm simply going to list the 4 grades in this order. The first number that you will see will be the grade over part 1 of the Iliad exam. The second grade will be part 2. The third grade will be your last exercise that you turned in answering questions over the Odyssey. And the fourth grade will be over the questions that I'm going to give you today. And in all likelihood, and I guess we'll just go ahead and say this, these questions that I'm going to give you today, I'm going to give you the benefit of, you need a little bit of time. Take this weekend, reflect a little bit, think about spend some time with your family. Here in Huntsville, you may have, where you live or where you are, we experienced a kind of, as though we don't have enough to contend with. We had a pretty severe storm last night, so power was knocked out in various locations. Fortunately, I think power's restored here. If I look a little bit disheveled, well, didn't get a great deal of sleep. I'm actually sitting in my study preparing this lecture for you. So the fourth grade then will be the exercise that you're going to turn in based on these questions that I will give you at the end of my discussion today. Now, these should be due no later than Tuesday by midnight. So go ahead and get these to me. This does not have to be the formal Word document. All you're going to do is by email, send me a, detailed enough answer to these questions. And then by the end of next week, I will send you through email your 4 grades in order to give you some kind of assurance. I know you're concerned about your standing and so forth, and you need to cooperate now and turn these assignments in. And some of you have had difficulty perhaps with your computer and so forth, but we still have to make as much progress as possible. And rest assured that I am going to discuss the Odyssey with you. Of course, these are not the circumstances that I would have preferred, and I'm probably not going to give you all of the information that I would have ordinarily given to you if we were in a class situation. Excuse me. So let me begin again by saying to you that the Odyssey is a sequel to the Iliad. There is a great change, if you will, between the two works. It would be like, for example, if you're familiar with the two works by John Milton, Paradise Lost, and Paradise Regained. So, what I want to call your attention to right now is there's an obvious movement between the two poems. If you want another word other than movement, I could use a word like motif or, for that matter, a theme. All right, in the Iliad, we moved or started with what I would call the tragic, and now in the Odyssey, we're going to move at various times to, there'd be some somewhat, and I think important, even sort of comic moments in the Odyssey. The Iliad is truly a formal epic. The Odyssey is too, but notice as you're reading the adventures, there are going to be these moments of romance. Notice the stay that Odysseus experiences, for example, with Calypso. Notice the physical, sexual attraction on her part for him, and with the other two as well. Remember reading about Circe and then reading about Nausicaa and the Phaeacians. A kind of third movement, theme, if you will. Note in the Iliad you had to experience the rage of Achilles against mortality. In the Odyssey, you're going to see the prudence on the part of Odysseus. What Odysseus, as I explained to you, but I do it again for emphasis, Odysseus wants to very much return home and recover what he had left behind, his family and kingdom. The Iliad very much is distant. In fact, as I said when we talked about the work in class, all of you may not have identified the work that fully, but I think through our discussion and through some of the performance on the part of the major exam, I think that you were able to connect, I'm rather pleased to say, fairly well. So in the Odyssey, we don't really have that distance that we might have in the Iliad. The Odyssey seems to me to cope with the problems of everyday life. Now, another point I want to make is in terms of character delineation. Look at Achilles in the Iliad. Some would say, and we talked about this in class, that he probably acted in a very childish way at times. He was part of the initiation. Initially, he was very immature. Now, think about Odysseus. He has to put away childish thoughts and things, feelings. He has to grow up. He has to live in this world. All right? Note, if you're not careful, you won't survive. In a sense, you might freeze to death, or there will be some other obstacle that could overcome your safety. Remember in reading Book 1 of the Odyssey, remember what Athena is going to tell Telemachus? It's time for you to become a man and go out there and find out about life. Go out there and gain some kind of experience. Now, as I continue, I would like to establish the fact for you that Odysseus, for all purposes, is a pragmatist. He's not impressed. In fact, he's very much unimpressed by differences that do not make a difference. So this is not necessarily true, if you will, of Achilles. Now, in the Odyssey, there is really very much a true sense of escapism. Odysseus really is a kind of dangerous man. He's a survivor. What he wants to do at all costs is to show that he has it within him to live another day. This desire on his part takes on another dimension, if you will, another aura of what I want you to see clearly as heroism. Now, probably the most important point I can make in this regard is the Odyssey exercises choices. Now, notice, it is Odysseus who who has to bear responsibility for what he does to Poseidon. So a great deal of blame must be put upon him. Now, in this regard, Odysseus always will have to exercise choice. The choice is heroic endurance, or do you want to, in a sense, face death? Now, I've already told you for all purposes that choice. There are temptations that will afford him. How will he react to these temptations? Once I remind you, this becomes the subject of the adventure section. Now, I'm getting across to you, or I would think you would even find this out in terms of your reading. And this almost becomes a kind of good essay question for you to consider for your major exam over the Odyssey. We have created this feeling of urgency in terms of the Odyssey. In other words, at all costs, it's time for Odysseus to get back home. All right? And you have seen from having read the first part of the Odyssey, he needs to get back home to establish order. He needs to get back home to establish relationships in terms of, members of his family, members of his community, and so forth. Now, what I want to show you, in order for Odysseus to get back home, we must be concerned with what I call 3 phases pertaining to his return. The idea is, I said this in my last lecture, he's not fit to return yet. All right? The gods know this. If he does, you can already figure out what would happen to him. So I want to talk to you a bit about 3 phases pertaining to his return. In other words, when I say 3 phases, he's got to experience in what I call rites, and the word is spelled R-I-T-E-S. So 3 things must happen to him. He's got to experience, if you will, all 3 of these, and I'll outline in terms of the adventures how these rites occur. The first thing he's got to experience is the rite of what is called separation. Now, what this means is he's got to separate all of these feelings, all of these, desires, all of this business about having associated, or his having associated with the Trojan War experience. All right, he won't function. He can no longer function as this kind of hero. He can't be, in other words, he can't come back and embrace the so-called warrior mentality. So he's got to separate, in a sense, from his past to the time that he is with Calypso. Now, you remember you have read in terms of Book 5, his stay with Calypso. One of the things that must happen, the choice is he could stay with her, particularly as you're going to find out in one of the questions that I'm going to give you. I would think staying with her would be a rather tempting offer. Notice what she's going to say she will give him if he will stay with her. Now, a second thing that must happen is once he separates himself from, say, his so-called Trojan past, and the idea of, with Calypso, living a kind of utopian moment. This is something that man has searched. Find that ideal place. Probably for all purposes, he may have it, in a sense, with Calypso. All right. Now, the next rite is what I call the rite of transition. All right. The rite of transition occurs when you read about his stay with the Phaeacians. I think that is one of the most important adventures that you're going to read about. To me, it too is a kind of utopian moment, but it takes on itself a kind of reality. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more as I get into the particular chapter, the adventure with you. So the gods are saying, okay, now you're at a kind of turning point in your life. What do you want to do? Do you want to cling back to the past? Do you want to live in this so-called utopian environment? Or do you want to go back home? What do you want to do? What's important to you? What's part of your so-called value system? And Odysseus has got to make up his mind. No one's going to make up his mind for him. So he experiences what I call the rite of transition. It bridges a gap. Very importantly, it bridges this gap between the real and the unreal world. And then the next rite that he's got to experience is called the rite of incorporation, incorporation. Now, this will begin with chapter 13. And what happens here, when I say the rite of incorporation, he has got to be received back into the society that he has left. Now, I keep reminding you, he has been gone for 20 years. Can you imagine? Look in terms, think about when we experienced the beginning of this century. It is now 2020. People, look at the changes that have occurred. Look at what we're experiencing, in a sense, today. So what happens with Odysseus? He can't just after 20 years come back and say, here I am. I'm going to pick up where I left off. It won't work. What's so important for you to remember in terms of human existence is life has changed. All right. So probably that third section, some say, will move a little bit slower. One reason it moves a little slower is you need time for Odysseus to readjust back into the society that he has left. And the way that this must happen, he's got to undergo, if you will, a series of physical recognition by people that he will experience once he gets back home. Now, once you get into your reading and you read very carefully, he's not going to return as this boastful, heroic warrior. You remember, we give him credit for all purposes as the one who has ended the Trojan War by his use of his intelligence, his wit, his design, if you will, of the Trojan horse. Remember, as you read, he's going to come back home. No one's going to know him. He's going to come back disguised. And if you want him to be humble, I think that, my gosh, he comes back as a pretty miserable old beggar, or hardly the attribute of what we would want to foster, a quality that an attribute given to the person who's just ended, in a sense, or help end the Trojan War. Now, in order for him to get back home, he's got to undergo still some other rites, so as to speak. One thing that I call your attention, and these are repeated over and over from time to time. In order to make all of this possible, you're going to have to deal many times with his having, as we all do in terms of the human condition, look about sleep. Sleep, to me, is a very important means of transition. Now, in the adventure section, sleep can be destructive. Once he gets back home, it's going to be the opposite. It's going to restore him to health, for example. Notice how many times they mention this idea of bath. You remember, as he's going to leave one adventure and go into another adventure, he has to undergo the rite of bath. Bath symbolizes a kind of rebirth. It's a kind, if you will, of self-purification. You remember, in terms of these utopian moments, like with Calypso, before he goes out on a new adventure, she's going to give him a bath. All right, so I think that this is an important consideration here. Now, another point I want to make, in order for all of this that I've been talking about to happen, his triumph, and he will be successful at the end of the poem, it's only possible because of his exceptional nature. And this is how we're going to define this new heroism in terms of Odysseus. Now, I don't want to mislead you by any means. Odysseus is physically powerful. He's skilled very much in the arts of war. We don't lose sight here. However, what I have to emphasize again, what really distinguishes him is a quality of mind. This quality of mind, the Greeks have a very special word, and I want to give you this word. It's designated by this term, and I will spell it for you, metis. Put a little mark over the E. And what this word, metis, suggests, it's this idea of intelligence. It's this idea, if you will, of being cunning. And as we said, in a sense, in the Iliad, it's this idea of having a kind of ability to use language, to articulate, to be an orator. And you know, he's been very successful. Now, another reason he will experience a kind of triumph in terms of behavior is that he's got to, and this also is a kind of good essay question for you to consider, he's got to show a distinction. He's got to show his ability by understanding what I call the difference between appearance and reality. In terms of appearances, I've just said to you, he's still the warrior. But that's not good enough. In reality, in order to survive, for example, he's got to show his ingenuity in being a craftsman. Remember, when he leaves Calypso's island, he's going to build his raft. How else do you think that he's going to make it to his next destination? All right, he's still a warrior. But I think for all purposes, one of his most important tactics is his ability in a most effective way to use disguise. Remember, when you get to your reading and you get to the adventure with the Cyclops, notice he's very careful not to reveal initially his true identity to the Cyclops. Now, something gets in the way, and he's going to have to pay the price. But remember, he uses the word nobody. Again, how humbling. For all purposes, he is a nobody. All right? And then, still the warrior in appearance. In reality, he's a wanderer. He's going to go from place to place. In fact, the Phaeacians will look at him as this kind of wanderer. And then I said, okay, you can still carry on with this idea of his being a warrior, but then, as I've already told you, when he gets back home, he simply is this broken down beggar. Now, in order for this to be believable for you, I want you to see that he has to exercise a form of discipline. Uh, what he's got to adopt really a kind of new persona. Um, in other words, he's got to be ready to accept the fact that maybe initially, in order to survive, he may be this warrior. All right, he's got to embrace qualities that traditional heroes cannot tolerate. In other words, he's got to suggest a kind of self denial in this regard. All right, one of the things look, part of what must happen to him is he's got to adopt an attitude of obscurity. Also, this idea of honor is not going to be that important to him any longer. Remember, when he left the Trojan War, it was of great premium. All right, the greatest glory now is to get back home and to be with his family. See, the gods are going to have a new purpose for him, which we will discuss when we begin our textual study of the poem. All right, now, what has to happen in order for all of this to occur that I've been talking about, we've got to delay his satisfaction. Odysseus, just like Achilles, must endure suffering. All right, now, this is important because these are necessary for his ability to perform these so-called brilliant feats, these brilliant tasks. See, really what you want Odysseus to do in terms of the poem is to add a kind of feeling of legitimacy to his life. And I think for all purposes, by the time you finish the poem, he will become very, not that he's not entirely now, but really a more, shall I say, legitimate character and a human being. But as I said in terms of the Iliad, when we talked about Achilles, all of this is not going to happen until we finish the last chapter of the poem. Now, what I want to call your attention to, and you're not reading all of these, because if you're reading in the anthology, you're not going to have all of the chapters. Some would say, really, how many adventures does Odysseus probably participate in? I'm probably making a rather important claim for you here. He's going to experience probably some 11 different adventures. And what I've got to show you is this. When he's with Calypso, this is going to be that moment in the present. All right, that's going to, and then he's going to leave Calypso, and then he's going to go to the island of the Phaeacians. And when he's with the Phaeacians, they're going to ask him, once they come to understand him, they're going to ask him in a sense about his past. You know, they're probably the king of the Phaeacians has figured out who he is, but notice he puts no pressure on Odysseus. When it's time, Odysseus will feel comfortable with the Phaeacians, and he's going to reveal his identity. Now, all of the adventures, with the exception of what I've just explained to you, all of the adventures have actually occurred. Now, what Homer does, and I think that this shows the skill of Homer, very much as a poet, very much as a writer, he makes use of a particular technique in literature that we call the flashback. And the flashback is a device that recreates in the present events that have occurred in the past. And I think many of you have heard of what a flashback is. All right, you literally go back in time and reconstruct an event that has occurred. Well, what Odysseus is going to do is to tell about his past to the Phaeacians. Now, that's very important. They're going to consider this to be, a great story. What a great narrative. See, this is something that they themselves have not experienced. All right. But Odysseus has. Now, what is so good about the flashback, as he recollects his past, he's going to have an opportunity to think about what has happened. See, he has the memory of the experience. The Phaeacians, for the first time, will hear his narrative, and it's only through a kind of vicarious moment that they might feel what he has felt. They haven't actually experienced the essence of what he's talking about. Now, I think, again, as I'm explaining to you, this shows the skill on the part of Homer, because Odysseus has an opportunity as he tells his various adventures. My gosh, in this adventure, what a fool I was. Why did I do this? Remember how many times we do? We go, something happens, and then we think about it later and we say, why did I do this? This was dumb. Right? Also, this is good for Odysseus, don't you see? And it gives him this opportunity, if you will, to rethink his past. You want to live in the past? You want the present. And also, you very much want the future. See, part of this whole called business, when I had explained the heroic code of behavior as we discussed the Iliad, what's really going to be very important, I think that Odysseus, as I've used the term in the Iliad, he too is a hero par excellence. But in order to be fulfilled as this hero initially, he's got to come back home and receive all of the praises from those people that he has left behind. Notice this doesn't quite happen in this regard to Odysseus, because he's not going to be that same hero. This is what I can point out to you as I begin our study, if you will, of the text of the Odyssey. So if you need a further clarification, I'll go over it as I get into the adventures and I can show you. So I wanted to offer you this little bit more in terms of background. And then, as I said, I've already asked you to read up to book 9 and go ahead and continue and read some more chapters. Read as much as you can. In fact, it would be good, certainly by next week, if you can finish what you have in terms of your anthology. And if you happen to be using one of the prose translations, you're at an advantage because you have the complete Odyssey, the complete 24 chapters. So I'm going to make it work for all of you. In case some of you are using still the anthology, you're not going to be behind. Notice that as you go from the various chapters that you're given a little bit of a caption, a little bit of a summary, what may have already occurred. So think about that as you read. So I think that for today, this will conclude my background lecture on the Odyssey. Now, what I want to do is next week then, and I'll apprise you of what of the times and so forth. I'll prepare another video as I get into the various chapters of the Odyssey itself. So I'm going to conclude this morning. And if you're looking, as I mentioned or may not have mentioned, but I'm seated because I can't do anything else. I'm upstairs in my house in my study. You see the books behind me. And I'm going to have to get out a little bit and try to walk. This isolation is sort of getting the best of me. I'm sure it's getting the best of you. So I do want all of you to have a good weekend and think about the significance of this weekend. regardless of how spiritual you may or may not be. And again, I keep, as I've done in the past, want to encourage you. It's going to take a little, see, I talk about suffering. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I really believe that we can get through some of this. And hopefully, like Odysseus, we will have learned some lessons, and we're going to have to decide for ourselves what's important in life. So now I'm dictating these questions. I repeat to you, I want you to submit the answers to me by email. It does not have to be a formal Word document. It's very much like the last series of questions that you submitted to me. So this is Friday. I said, for all purposes, get these to me by, I would think Tuesday evening, if you will, by midnight. All right? So that gives you plenty of time. In fact, you could maybe do a little bit of work if you want to over the weekend, and you have Monday and you have really all day on Tuesday. And then shortly I will post this, and some of you may even have a little bit of time and you want to look at it a bit today. So I'm dictating the questions to you. Number one, why do the suitors plan to kill Telemachus? This is a follow-up of what I asked you in the last series of questions. Now something has happened, and the suitors have decided that they must kill Telemachus. Why is that? A second question pertains to Book 5. Why does Zeus send Hermes to see Calypso? What's the purpose of, now remember Odysseus is with her. Why does Hermes go to see Calypso? And then, as a kind of follow-up to this question, I want you to describe Calypso's home. Homer provides you a very, very good insight into her dwelling. Talk about that for me a little bit. Number 3, what does Odysseus tell Calypso about his staying with her? In other words, I've been explaining to you this business of choice. Think about that. The time is going to come for him to leave. What is he going to tell her about why he wants to leave? And then I have as a follow-up question, note this, it's most important. What gifts does she offer him? What gifts does she offer him? Now, question 4, he leaves her. What is an obvious threat to Odysseus as he leaves Calypso's island? I repeat it. What is an obvious threat to Odysseus as he leaves Calypso's island? And then a follow-up to that question is, how does he survive? How does he, in other words, I think this is a kind of, if you will, momentary adventure itself. How does he make it? And then my last question, which will be number 7, summarize the importance of Book 7 in the Odyssey. What does Odysseus learn from his stay among the Phaeacians? That's the follow-up question. I repeat it. What does Odysseus learn from his stay among the Phaeacians? So I think you have enough time, and I will have then, as I said, by the end of the week, an opportunity to mail you through email 4 grades. I repeat, when you receive this email documentation concerning your grades, and I'm not going to specify, that's why I'm doing this now. The first grade will be part 1, the Iliad. The second grade will be part 2, the Iliad. The third grade will be the grade on the first series of questions that you submitted over the Odyssey. And then the 4th grade will be these questions that I've just dictated. So do have a good day, have a good weekend, and we'll talk a little bit later. I'll let you know about the next video. Thank you very much. Goodbye.